So I will just do a brief presentation of Jessica, and also I think some of you were here on Tuesday seeing Jessica's film. So let's do the presentation first. So Jessica Sarah Rinland's work has been screened and exhibited internationally at important film festivals as Locarno, Biennale, Toronto, New York, Mar del Plata, Rotterdam, Oberhausen, and Cinema do Riel. She has directed several short films and a feature, those that at a distance resemble another, screened on Tuesday at our film club, that won a special mention at Locarno and Best Film at Documenta Madrid. Her films try to understand how humans search for the preservation of their memory on archaeological sites, museums, or nature societies. They look on how we identify, classify, and reproduce works of art, other historical objects, and things from nature. The films are also delicate works of thinking about these issues and at the same time the physical effort of working in these fields. That's why we see many hands in the films and their constant movement and the words and bodies of the ones that carry out this work incessantly. We even see Jessica hands, and I don't know if you saw the final credits of the film, but there was some funny references you should see again. We even see Jessica hands, the filmmaker's way of physically understanding labor in front of the camera. Jessica also combines documentary and experimental traditions, making films in which images and sounds produce sensations and emotions, the ones that are like the people she documents. Jessica is currently a visiting professor at the Wesley College, and works as an educator at Aulas Abertas in Escola, previously at Kingston University, and as projectionist at the Barbican Center. She holds a BA in Fine Arts from Central St. Martin's University of Arts London and an MC in Arts, Culture and Technology from the MIT. Jessica, thank you very much.
Obrigado, Daniel, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the university and the technicians as well. Too far away? Yeah. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes. You'll excuse me that I'm going to read because I've written something, and I haven't memorized it, so I'm just going to read it. I'll start with a moment I always go back to when I was in Los Esteros de Liberá, a wetland in Corrientes, the north of Argentina. I had woken up early to film animals at sunrise. My legs and tripod were submerged in water, preparing my Bolex camera to film a heron, which is a bird. I was very close, about a meter away from the heron, and it wasn't paying attention to me. It was doing whatever it was doing, and I wanted to film it doing that. But the very moment that I pressed the trigger on the Bolex, she suddenly started moving her head, looking for the sound, looking into the lens, and then flying away. These reactions provoke a sense of intimacy between the animal and I, a mutual interruption. I'm interrupting her in her everyday moments while she's interrupting me wanting to film them. There are two educational filmmakers from the 1930s who made instructional films called Mary Field and Percy Smith, who made the series called Secrets of Nature, and they also wrote a book called Secrets of Nature, which is kind of like an educational guide of how to make documentary nature films. And in the book, they talk about this kind of mutual interruption. So there's a quote, specifically when they're filming in a zoo. So the quote is, you might think of the battery lights from which human film actors always declare they wince might prove upsetting to the animals in the zoo. But on the contrary, I believe that the visits of our unit with its lamps mark high spots of enjoyment in the lives of zoo inmates. Under the lamps, the hornbill hopped ecstatically up and down his perch, and to the joy of the keeper, and incidentally of ourselves, opened his wings wide with happiness, a very rare occurrence. They continued to discuss various different animals and their reaction to, as they put it, the artificial summer. A cheetah who had not moved in 4 weeks opened his eyes and staggered to his feet in reaction to the crew and equipment, and a somersaulting monkey that clung onto the netting, toasting his tummy every time the lights were turned on, to the frustration of the filmmakers whose aim it was to film the animal in action. So these are films from the Sequence in Nature series that I mentioned, and they've kind of been an ongoing interest of mine since I started making films, like in 2006. They're filmed in labs, museums and zoos and in the wild, translating science for the layman, showing before, well, they used to show before the features and the newsreels in cinemas. And so, some of this science hasn't held up. So this is where part of my interest lies, like this kind of male voice in a godly tone, constructing and disseminating facts that continue shifting over time as knowledge changes. So I'm going to show, I won't show all of it, but I'll show a little bit of one of my favorite films. They're all 10 minutes. This one's called Magic Mixies.
As you see them now, they are vegetable. Each tiny toadstool becomes covered with little cells, and these are blown away by the wind. If they fall into water, they turn into animals, tiny water creatures with a little tail to help them swim about. To get some idea of how tiny they are, look at this picture. The thing like a barge pole in the front is a human hair, and yet, even at this magnification, the mixes are those tiny specks moving about in the background, almost too small to see. The only things tiny enough for the mixes to eat are bacteria, and as these are usually found near decaying matter, the mixes gather around any floating rubbish. While it is in this form, each mixing has the power of splitting in half and becoming two mixes, and at this rate they multiply rapidly. Suddenly the mixie draws in its tail and changes into quite a different form. It is still an animal, but has no fixed shape, and eats by surrounding its food. It continues to like bacteria, but now, however, it does not take the meat, but adds a drop of water as an aid to digestion. The mixes now begin to join together, first into pairs, and then into parties. greater encouragement to matrimony than any tax on bachelors. When the party of the mixers is large enough, it decides to leave the water and adventure onto dry land. The nixie now turns back from being an animal into being a plant again. It is a most peculiar creature, for its body has absolutely no support such as skin or bones. It is quite fluid, and the shape is always changing as it flows around. In the moving shape, however, are channels whose contents flow forwards, stop, and then flow backwards. To see this movement, follow the course of one black speck. This couple in the middle are a good example. This ebbing and flowing cause the nixie to advance like the sea in waves. When two mixes meet, they immediately join forces and flow away together. The nixie has no eyes, yet it can detect light which it dislikes, for it withdraws immediately. In the same way,
I'm going to stop it there. So these moments of mutual interruption continue to follow me today. Here is a similar moment with a hunting dog from one of my last films, Sol de Campinas, from 2001. A film that has more to do with the earth, soil, and a group of archaeologists. And I was there in the winter of 2018 for a few weeks in the state of Acre in Brazil, volunteering as an archaeologist, well, volunteering as an archaeologist, as an amateur or whatever. But I also took my Bolex, of course, and a few rolls of film. So one of the things I like about shooting on 60mm, I don't know, do you get to shoot on 60mm film here? No, okay. Well, one of the things that I like about film, and well, I've only shot on 16 and a bit on Super 8, is that I have a determined amount of time to film. So in this instance, I had around 50 minutes in rolls of 100-foot films, which 100 foot is about 3 minutes, for 3 weeks of being there. I also took my Zoom sound recorder and my 35mm photo camera, and I, of course, had my phone camera with me. So I had a lot of time between the 50 minutes and more or less like 80 photos and maybe 3 hours of sound that I recorded in total. So the majority of time, I'm not looking through the lens. I'm meeting people, talking, forming relationships, digging, learning what the layers of earth mean and how a spade is used in this context. You could say that this also forms part of the process of filmmaking, but it's not a conscious research process for me. I'm interested in people, other forms of thinking or knowing, their relationships with a spade or a dog. This interaction is what really interests me. And because I was there as a volunteer, I was paying attention to their gestures that showed the knowledge of their hand in relation to the tool or the earth. And I was imitating or copying their gestures to learn how to do what they were doing. So this is a moment from that film. I'm just going to pause this.
A cerâmica daqui é a nossa bem simples.
Oh, sorry, the subtitles are in Spanish. Sorry. Well, you can...
São pedaços de cerâmica. A cerâmica daqui é nossa bem simples. Por enquanto não encontramos nenhum com pintado, por exemplo. Não, mas tem a questão do crítico, né? Eles usavam, faziam com pedras, machadinho, essas coisas, nessa região. Então, a coisa... porque aqui não tem pedra, né? No Rio tem. Pode ser que eles traziam de lá. Sempre tem essa possibilidade. Em 2014 a gente encontrou um pedaço de lítico e agora parece que vamos encontrar outro também. E para eles fazerem machadinha, martelo, alguma coisa do tipo.
So when I give Bolex classes, my students sometimes ask me how I hold the camera when I do handheld. So how I focus and do everything with two hands. So I show them my gesture, my right hand with my finger over the trigger. The camera weight is held with my elbow leaning against the side of my stomach, and some of the weight is up against my left eye. There I have my left hand free to interact with the lens, to change focus or change the f-stop. These are my gestures that are part of my procedural memory that have been getting better over the past 15 years. I could not be filming anything for 2 years, but this part of my memory would recall these actions. In Sole Campinas, I intended to learn the gestures of archaeologists. And in my previous film, Those That at a Distance Resemble Another, I copied the gestures of conservators. I'll just show, I know you saw it yesterday, but I'll show a clip of it. Okay, also, I'm sorry, but I think the subtitles to everything are in Spanish. I'm sorry. Some of them don't even have dialogue. This doesn't have dialogue, so it's fine. Is that it? Okay. It's a very short clip. When I started meeting conservators in the process of making this film, I started to realize the incredible proximity they had between themselves and the objects they were working with. I call them conservators, but there were also archaeologists and artists who were conserving objects. That clip are the hands of Erengera Oliveira, an archaeologist who was studying and making comparisons between the patterns of Marajoara funerary urns in the Urpi in Sao Paulo in Maio, the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. To study them, she covers them in different layers of plastic and physically traces the patterns. She then lays them out and copies them again with precise measurements. So this is another example of this proximity conservators have to the object they're restoring. This is a Bernini stucco that was conserved by Tony Siegel at the Strauss Center for Conservation at Harvard Art Museums in the US, in Boston. He wrote this paper that showed the process detailing how Bernini moved the clay towards his body with his thumb rather than away from him with another finger. I'd never met anyone who was not an artist himself who would have this closeness and precise knowledge of the art object or the object. It was as if these people were embodying the artist, Tony to Bernini, Ere to the unknown person who made the pattern. I then thought it would be interesting to highlight this practice by flipping it, me as an artist embodying the conservator. So these here, as Daniel mentioned, are my hands.
Y después le pedí al
it's in English.
conservador que el experto que me lo rompa. No quería porque es lo opuesto de lo que hace normalmente, que es demorar la muerte de los objetos. Ellos estudian y saben tantos detalles de los objetos que de alguna forma personifican el artista original que creó la obra para poder arreglarlo o replicar. Pero al final la convencí, me lo hizo. Rompió la parte, como ves, que normalmente va unido a la boca del elefante. Lo rompió con un martillo. Y después me enseñó cómo arreglarlo con este pegamento que está hecho de piel de algún animal.
So I also imitated the sounds their gestures would make. So this is my Foley setup. So a layer of sound above the manipulated wildlife sounds. I'll show a clip in a sec. So I wanted, in a way with this film, for the viewer to be taken outside of the lab to the place where the materials had come from, instead of thinking about where the object came from. I wanted the focus to be on the material, the elephant ivory from Malawi, and how did it come to be in Nigel Bamforth's hands at the Victoria and Albert Museum, for example, with this one. So what interests me, or one of the things that interests me most about sound in film, is the ability it has to take the viewer elsewhere, to imagine a different space or the surrounding space to the close-up image, the off-screen. In another film of mine, Black Pond, I use sound to take the viewer into another space, but perhaps further into the images. The film was shot over a period of 4 years, and every time I would process and digitize the rolls, I also shot on 16mm, I would show it to the Natural History Society who were in the film. I would record their voices as they reacted to the pictures, either remembering moments, species, or something related to what they were seeing. This perhaps gives a viewer a different perspective of the images that appear in the film. So I'll show it.
I don't think there was any ultrasound coming to the camera from memory. It's ultrasound that's been more likely to take them to solve. I think the detectors going, I don't recall any interference being generated. Sometimes with modern video cameras you get interference when you're zooming in on the lens. The little motor that adjusts the lens emits ultrasound sometimes.
So this film, Black Pond, although I started filming this particular film in 2014, this is where my parents, near where my parents live in the south of London, in the suburbs. So the first time I filmed with a Bolex in 2006, I filmed in this space. I'm going to show that film, which is quite a bit different to this other stuff in that it's silent as well. I think it's only 5 minutes. Yeah, it's only 4 minutes. So 8 years after I filmed this, oh, thanks. So 8 years after I filmed this, every winter maybe I should give actually some context of this land. So in 2000 and, no, sorry, in the 1600s, so this is a common, I'm going to go back a little bit. This is a common, which I don't know if commons exist here in Portugal. This idea of a land that is owned by, historically this land was owned by king or queens or aristocrats. And there were various laws that were in place for the commoner, the everyday person, to use the land. So there were various laws, like you were allowed to graze your goats or animals on there, you were allowed to play sports, you were allowed to like walk across the fields. There were various things you could do, but there were also various things you couldn't do. You couldn't farm, you couldn't build. This specific land has an interesting history because in the 17th century, in the 1640s, there were a group of agrarian socialists called the Diggers on St. George's Hill, which is right next to this, who fought against this. They were part of like an anti-enclosure movement. So they fought against the idea of, or the fact of not being able to farm or not being able to build. And this, in the 1920s, the land was bought by the local government, as many of the commons in the UK were. And now it's still owned by, so it's the Elmbridge Borough, like the kind of the local government. So just to give a bit of context of that land, it's funny because the laws have kind of slightly changed since the 80s because it became a site of scientific, special scientific, a triple SI, a site of scientific special interest. So it has a few more laws, but the laws of like being able to graze your animals and not being able to farm and build and things like that are still very much in place. So in the winter of 2014-15, I noticed that they were cutting a lot more trees down than they were. They would cut down trees every winter, but this was a lot that they were cutting down. So I just went into the local council and asked if there was someone that I could speak to about this because I was curious about why this year this was happening. And there I met this guy called Dave Page, who was the ranger, the countryside manager, is the countryside manager. And he's like a very, very generous person, became a very good friend. And he showed me, he basically kept everything that the archive had thrown away in the past years that he'd been there. He'd been working there for like 20 years. And so he, like, other than saying his answer to my question of cutting the trees down, which was not satisfactory to me, which is probably why I made the film, but then I never answered the question in the film either. But his answer to me was to bring the land back to how it was, this kind of idea of cutting down the non-native trees. But it's like an absurd idea, like when was that land how it was originally? When we kind of got past my questioning of the trees, he showed me his archive of things that he'd collected from the council, and he also introduced. I'm going off script, so I'm getting confused. Yeah, so I'm going to skip this. I know what, yeah. So he introduced me to the Natural History Society, the local Natural History Society that he was part of, who's the Elmbridge Natural History Society, who's a mixture, it's a mixture of amateurs, people that really just love being in nature and learning, and then you have naturalists, and you also have Brian Spooner, who's like the head mycologist at Kew Gardens, which is like a big deal, like the head fungi person in the UK. So it's like a real mix of people who are going around there meeting. So they meet like spring, summer, autumn. They meet on Tuesdays every other week, and they walk for about 2-3 hours around a certain part of the common. And then in winter, they do like town hall meetings. So I'll go back to the script. So in this case, although we were collecting in very different ways, my gestures were similar to theirs. So my 100-foot roll of film, loading and unloading, kind of mimicked in a way or had a relationship with their containers of moths and leaves, which they then were processing, and we were both kind of eventually uploading to digital databases. So all this material that they find and they collect, is updated digitally, and it's collected by the Natural History Museum in London. It has these databases that go back really far, to the 1800s. So it was a long process, well, relatively long, 5 years of making the film. So there was a lot of, although there wasn't a lot of, my ratio to when I shoot, to how much I shoot, to how much I end up putting in the film is quite tight. I don't end up shooting that much. But there was definitely a lot of archive and a lot of other material. Dave is a really amazing photographer. There was a lot of historical things that I wasn't able to include in the film. So a lot of times when I make films, I also make books with them. Normally, well, the times that I've made them before, I make like 2 or 3 copies and I hand sew them myself. They're very like handmade. But with this film, it was the first time that a publisher in Switzerland published this book. So this book was published just in November, so quite a few years since 2014 we were working on it. And so I wanted to read just so it's kind of, it starts with the list. There are about 25-30 members of the society at the moment, although it keeps changing, so this might not even be relevant since November anymore. And then it has these acts, these kind of chapters. So you have the commons, tree felling, black pond, old trees, moth genitalia, fungi, foray, and bat calls. I'll leave it up here so you can look at it afterwards. But and then it has an archive section at the end where I was able to kind of include documents. So this was the document of the government buying the land. There's like documents here that I wasn't able to include in the film. But it's also a book. You don't have to have seen the film to like understand and interact with this book. It's all, so that's kind of a picture, an aerial photo from the 70s. Wait, I wanted to show. So this text here that's throughout the book is text mostly from the film. Some of it is not from the film, from the voiceover. And then the publisher, actually, who's a friend now, Gregor Huber, he had this idea because he was so... he loved the sound of the film, and he was like, how can we somehow include sound in a book? And I was like, that's not impossible. And Philippe Champy, who's the sound designer that I've been working with for years, will be against this idea with like converting sound to language. But he was like, well, what about captions, like the idea of like captioning sound in subtitles and all of that. And I really liked the idea. So I rang Philippe, and of course Philippe was like, no, absolutely not. He's like Swiss, French, big beard. He's like, absolutely not. You can't talk about sound in terms of language. He studied like ethnomusicology and stuff. He's an amazing person. And then like through like conversations and talking about the book and things like that, finally, he was like, okay, maybe we can talk about it and try and come up with some kind of descriptions if we like think about this idea of like closed captioning for people that are hard of hearing. So they're kind of distributed a little bit through the book there. And then another thing that's probably the main structure of the book is emails between the Society and I throughout the years that I've known them. So it starts off with this email, which is the first email that Dave sent to me. And it's all emails to me. There are no emails, because there's so much of my perspective in here that I just wanted the emails to be their perspectives to me. And yeah, that's kind of, and it's a mix, like I said, of stills from the film, and then this is like one of my favorite photographs that Dave took, let's see, in like the 80s. So there's kind of like a mixture of things in there. And it is based, the book itself, well, the inside of it is based on these observer books, which were this collection from like the 70s of, it wasn't only natural history, they had like books on furniture and things like that. It's kind of based like that with the logo of the Society on the back. But I wanted to finish by reading the beginning, which is kind of the list of the main characters in the film and in the book. So it starts off with, this is Dave Page. Neat cuticles, no layers of dirt under fingernails, although they regularly interact with soil. Opisthena consistently bronzed throughout the year. Oh, wrong one, sorry. Actually, no, that was the right one. I changed the order. Wait, I'll read this one first. So this is Dick Alder. Deep digital creases, petite thumbs mean the index finger has to stretch further to reach it. The one before. Brian Spooner, sharp knuckles and strong veins, fingernails left to grow more than a week. Lynn Whitfield, broad thumbnail, nails kept at a length of approximately 11 millimeters. Often hidden inside gloves or interacting with bats. Ross Baker, neatly trims nails every 4 days, ring slightly tight on left finger, but perfectly placed between the middle and proximal part. And finally, Paul Wheeler, not much knuckle hair, steady grip with tools when identifying micro moths. And that's me. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. It was really interesting, and I have a copy also, so you can ask me to see it. I was hearing you, and I thought of 2 or 3 ideas. One of them was like most of the things you make and the people you film. In a way, it seems like almost that you are in a game, like you were a kid and playing something that you like a lot. And even the sequence you show us, it is a game, the thing that he opens. And it's really interesting to see how really these people that you film, and maybe yourself also, are like kids in a playground and doing stuff that they do like a lot. And in a way, also close to that, thinking cinema as a craft and as something that you have to materially connect. And your description of how to use your bollocks like connected to your body, it was really interesting to see how you do this, how do you film, and how the camera connects to the people. Well, just these 2 or 3 ideas from what you said. Maybe I can ask you something which it is also a curiosity, and it also connects with everything that you said. How you connect to these people after the film was made. In a way, this is the natural question about did you show the film to them and how did they react? But it is more than that. Of course, you made a book in this case, but it seems like you really connect to the people, and this connection is really decisive. Sorry, this English is bad. So decisive to the final project and also life in a way.
Yeah, thanks. Depending on the film, but most, especially the last films, most of the people that are in the films become friends of mine or are friends of mine in the process. The way that I've been making films is that the reason that I enter these institutions is because I meet people that then introduce me to other people that then recommend me to go and see other people, and then so on and so on. So it's always friends of friends or colleagues of colleagues, especially with those at a distance. That's why I was able to travel to so many places, to museums in Brazil, the US, and the UK. Was because of meeting people. When I was at MIT, I took a class in conservation at the Harvard Art Museums, and I met the director, Narayan Kandekar, who's also an artist. And then I took a class in archaeology with Eduardo Neves, who is the director of the maio at USP, or has his own lab at the maio in the USP in Sao Paulo, and he's quite a top archaeologist. So he introduced me. He was like, you need to go here, here, here. And because I was at MIT, I was able to get funding to go to Brazil. So yeah, it's all kind of, and then because I work that way, they become friends normally. Richard Sabin, who is in those, I've worked with on quite a few films. He's the curator of mammals at the Natural History Museum in London. I met him, I can't even remember. I'd been making a lot of films about whales, which I hardly ever speak about anymore. And I had found out that he, although he was into mammals in general, he is specialized in whales. And so I just kept on knocking on the door and emailing and calling him until he kind of got sick of me. And now I was just texting him today because I need to go visit him about something at the museum. But yeah, that's kind of the relationship. And with Dave, he's actually from Black Pond. We're doing a release of the book at a bookshop in London when I'm back next week. And he, because the back of the book isn't that detailed. The descriptions of the photographs are not very detailed, and he didn't like that very much. He didn't say, he wasn't but he was like, I'm going to make a supplementary booklet that explains in detail all the archive and all the photographs and where they come from. And it's kind of amazing. He sent me that yesterday. of like 4 pages of like detailed details of the photograph, which of course I love, and I would love to also be able to sell the book with that booklet with it. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of why. And with Black Pond, they were watching the material as I was seeing it as well, so it was a different kind of like showing the film. Yeah, and if I'm like Sol de Campinas, a few of the archaeologists who I was working with, obviously I haven't seen them since I was there then, but they've, like, I remember in Cinema de Rel, they were like, oh, you can invite 2 people to the virtual. So I was like, Fernando, who was one of the archaeologists that I worked with, I invited him as like one of the viewers to the film festival online or whatever. I always, yeah. I mean, some people don't care that much though, about the film. Like you'll get people like Nigel, I don't feel like he cared that much. He's perfectly nice, like we still email and I keep him updated, but I don't think he cares that much. So it just depends, yeah.
Questions and comments? You can also ask questions about the film, if you saw it on Tuesday.
Thank you for the talk, and I had 2 small questions. One is, I think, well, maybe you can. I think I know what the answer will be, but you can talk a little bit on this because from your talk I get the notion that there is a very, in a way, importance of the idea of the precision on also because you're working with film, so exactly where to film or the moments you chose to film. And my first question was, would it be possible for you to do these precision techniques with digital or not? This is my first question. And the second one maybe connects a little bit with what Danielle asked or commented, which was the question of the game. Because regarding the film, there's this common idea that some people do films in order to observe reality, but also I get the feeling from seeing the excerpts and also the film that we saw Tuesday, that your film is also a way for you to learn through camera, like using the camera to learn people working on these activities. So my question is, in this process of using the camera for you to learn an activity, is there any moment where you interrupt this idea of getting to learn something to really think about what would it be for the spectator later, or it is just afterwards that you think of the spectator in these terms?
Thanks. The first question with the digital, it's funny because whenever I think about being precise about something, I think about that scene with Nigel yesterday when he's putting, in the film yesterday, in those where he's putting the tusks back into the drawer and they keep falling out. So that's maybe an answer to that question in a way. But the digital thing, I have nothing against digital at all. And I have filmed a few things, and filmed other people's films on digital. And I'm sure, I know that I have the same discipline. I think it's more about discipline than being precise to me. But the discipline, I mean, now I'm shooting a film that I have more money and I have more rolls of film and I have 400 feet of film, but I'm still in my head counting 20 seconds, which is like the Bolex, how long the Bolex lasts. So it's like that, it's just inside of me, and I'm working with a friend of mine as a camera assistant, and she's like, no, you can leave it longer. Why don't you count a minute rather than, and I'm like, oh, but film, it's so expensive. And she's like, you've got rolls of film, you can do more. So that discipline is definitely something that I still have, even like thinking about it, like if I were to have digital where I'd have endless time to film something. But something I am enjoying with the 400-foot rolls of film, I'm shooting handheld and I'm doing much longer shots of like moments, of like tracking moments, rather than like, I'm a bit sick of the tripod, I've used it so much. And it's specifically with this film as well, I'm working with zookeepers and their movements within a zoo. So there is like a lot of walking and a lot of following, rather than it being like a static lab space or something, which it kind of was in Black Pond as well, but it's different because they were slow. Like they were like fast moving through space, through the woods, but then they'd be slow lookers. So they'd spend a lot of time like looking at a leaf or something. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think the discipline would still be there if I were working in digital. And remind me the second one a little bit.
It was the question between using the camera to learn something.
Oh, okay.
And if in this process the spectator is also on it.
Oh, okay. It's funny, I guess this idea of thinking of the viewer, I do think about the viewer, but I think I'm not that conscious about it. Like even when I'm editing, I'm just doing it in a way where I'm feeling that one image or one sound goes with another, or it's more of like an organic thing or a reactionary thing to the material. It's not necessarily about the viewer. Or thinking consciously about the viewer. I've always struggled a bit with this idea of like, although I do when I'm talking and when I'm writing, I'm like the viewer, the viewer, the viewer, but when I'm actually making, I'm not like, I find it like it's not something that I naturally am consciously thinking about. And the idea, yeah, maybe that's the answer, yeah.
Thank you, Jessica, for your talk. I have two questions. One more process connected, and maybe I will start with that one, which is because we saw one of your earlier films this afternoon, and I was wondering how your experience with time evolved through your experience with film, because we see a very different rhythm then and now, and now you're telling us that in your next film there are some things that have changed in terms of process. So I was wondering, how was the evolution for you? I don't know if, at least when I worked with Super 8, I feel this anxiety of the sound of the camera that you are feeling the film going through, and the other question is more regarding this haptical quality of your films. And I remember you have an earlier film where you have the blind people touching a sculpture, and it's very interesting because you kind of convey this haptical feeling through not only through images and the hands that are very present, but also through the sound. This kind of composition gives us a little bit the feeling of the materials. I was wondering if you could talk also a little bit about that. Thank you.
Okay. The first question, remind me. Oh my God, my memory is really terrible. Time. I think my relationship with time, in the sense that you're talking about it, comes more from the cameras that I'm using. That was the first time I was working with a Bolex, so I was like, oh, this button does this button does that. I can like put the trigger really quickly, and obviously all the light frames are there as well. Like when you shoot on 16mm, every time you stop the camera, there are like 2 or 3 frames. Well, there's like one white frame, and then there's one frame that's lighter, and one on each like image that's before and after. And I was also like, the reason that I started making films was because I saw Jonas Mekas' Walden. So that was why I also was shooting that way. I was just kind of imitating what he was doing. Even in the fact where I've like gone and filmed in the woods, although that was like home, so that was slightly different. But yeah, I think that, and I think as I said before, and as you said, it has to do with just like, yeah, it's just the cameras that I'm using, and the and wanting to challenge myself every time that I do something new or that I make another film, because I think that like the subject matters are pretty much like, it could just be one big film that I'm making, because they're all very similar subject-wise. But I think formally, I think that's where I'm challenging myself more, is that I'm kind of trying different things out and seeing how they work with the subject. Or with the people that I'm working with. So, yeah, that's kind of maybe an answer to my relationship with time in that sense. And could you repeat just a little bit about the haptic, like what the question was?
Because I felt in your films, in most of them, at least in the most recent ones, the feeling of touch, it becomes very, you almost can feel it. And of course the way you film hands, it's very important, but also the sound gives you like a material feeling of the materials, of the objects, etc. I was wondering if this aspect comes to your mind when you are preparing a film or working. You already mentioned the gesture, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for repeating. So the film that you mentioned, Expression of the Sightless, which is a film that I made with David Johnson, who lost his sight when he was 9 years old. It's a film. So the process of that film was that I was working as an editor for online content for Tate in general, but we were located at Tate Britain, and I had read an article about a room in the Louvre which was made of replicas just for people that had lost their vision or were hard of seeing, and the room. Yeah, it was just like this kind of idea of access, I guess, of people being able to access with different types of seeing. Because especially after having spoken and met David, he speaks about touch as another way of seeing. So when I worked with him, I actually did film his face when I was making the film, but it was very obvious that you could tell that he was blind. And I felt very uncomfortable with that material that I filmed. The fact that he hasn't seen his face since he was 9 years old just felt very uncomfortable to me. And so I also, in the film, I wanted to replicate in a way his experience of understanding the sculpture. So it was this like kind of fake Greek sculpture made by like a British bloke in the 1800s. I can't remember Thomas something. I can't remember the name of Gibson, Thomas Gibson. And his experience was like touching it, and then as he like got around the whole thing, he kind of worked out what it was. And I asked him to like think out loud in the film. So he was saying, oh, this is a hand, oh, this feels like a breast, or something, like saying like what he's feeling as he's going through it. So you're hearing that. And then the whole film is in close-ups of his hand like feeling the sculpture, so the viewer in a way is getting a similar experience to what he is. And there's a flash frame of the whole, but it's just like 1 second of the whole sculpture in the film. So that was kind of where I became, because I was filming hands before when I filmed like a necropsy of a harbour porpoise, a small whale. But that was the first time that I became like conscious of like the relationship between, well, in this case it was a type of labor, but it was more of an exploration or an understanding of a space or of an object than work itself. And then with Black Pond, it was just very obvious because they were working with very small things. And the landscape, in a way, was like a hand. And they were just, everything was, even the bats were small and the moths were small and everything. So it was just something that I began focusing on. And I was interested in them not being like specific characters or like individuals, like the idea of like the individual or the species rather than the individual bat or the individual moth. I wanted to do something similar with the people, like this idea of playing with classification, which I think I do in a lot of my work. I kind of was playing with in the fact that you can never really see their faces, so you can only really like know who they are through their hands, but you might not get that at all because they're all just white hands on screen. So yeah, that's kind of where the haptic came from, and then the sounds came from that. And the sounds, the closeness of sounds I see as like a close-up in a way. Like the close-up of the image or the close-up of the sound, it creates something different in what you're seeing. And like I mentioned, like the idea of like also the off-screen sound, like allowing you to imagine another space or the space as a whole. Yeah.
Maybe you can expand a little bit more in the question of sound, especially in those at distance, because you showed how you made the Foley. How much Foley has the film, and how did you, in a way, it was in that moment that it came to my mind the word game, because actually you are playing with something. Well, can you expand a little bit more on that?
The film is, in a way, it's in two parts. There's the part of the experts, which is in 4/3, and it's with Foley. And then there's a part of myself working with Joel Seidner, who's a ceramicist, a sculptor, and Luis Arnias, who's a filmmaker who was like DP on the film, director of photography. And so there are two. That's shot in 16:9. So there are two soundscapes. So there's diegetic sound, which when we were the three of us were shooting, and to make that sculpture was a nightmare, and we'd work many days until 5 a.m. There were too many failures, but so I would just set up the boom like this on a tripod and leave it recording. I had sometimes, like there are some sound recordists credited, because maybe I'd have someone come in for 2 hours and then didn't have enough money to pay them anymore, so I just set it up on the boom. And so a lot of those conversations that we're having, where Luis is talking about Maximiliano, his friend, that used to dress up as a tree, or he talks about his daughter Eva, who's watching like natural history TV shows, documentaries. They're all from just like conversations of like the everyday work space. And then the other space was the experts, which it came, I think it started with just like oh wow, we really can't use any of the sound. Because it was just like, well, I have to say that with Black Pond, it's like 100% Foley, and like all the natural sounds are either recorded after the fact or are from Philippe's archive. So it's something that I'd worked with before. But what was I saying? The Foley, yeah, so the Foley came when, I guess, Philippe and I were like, okay, and I love doing Foley, and I'm quite good at it. Philippe says I'm quite good at it, and I like doing it. So I was like, and I like this idea of like replicating the gestures, and it was like a conceptual thing in a way as well, where I'm like, okay, well, I'm replicating what they're doing, so I'm going to replicate their sounds and all of this. And then we put the Foley in, and then Philippe and I were like, oh wow, it's really like it was dead. It was like dead sound. It was really, really stark. Like I wanted there to be a difference between the experts and me working, but it was too much. And Philippe never understood the beginning of the film. The film begins with a monkey in the Tijuca in Rio, in the urban forest. It's a monkey that had been, a howler monkey that had been reintroduced. And then the biologist who I'm filming with suddenly says that she has a baby, like that Carla has had a baby, the mother has, that she freed, that she liberated the year before. But anyway, he never understood. He was like, why is there a monkey at the beginning of the film? I don't understand. This was before I had the text and before I guess I'd really thought about it in a way where I could like articulate what I was doing. And I was like, well, it's about like, it's about this idea, well, the baby itself is the idea of like conservation and replicating and birth as a way of replicating on all of this. But the other thing that then we eventually started talking about was like, actually, I'm really interested in where these materials are coming from. So where, like I mentioned, like where is the ivory coming from? Where is the urn coming from? Like where is the clay coming from? Like we all know that it's like a Marajoa urn, like we all know that it's Indian ivory box. But where is the ivory coming from? Like what is the animal? Like what is that space where this sound is coming from? So again, we kind of went into Philippe's archive and found some of it's actually like from the places where the material might be from, and some of it is just like sounds. And then Philippe is a master at manipulating natural landscape sounds. So that was that as well. So kind of like this idea of like exploding the idea of the lab, which actually in Sol de Campinas, I do the opposite because I'm filming mostly in the field, and then there are sequences of like dead space in labs when the material has come back there. But yeah, that's kind of another subject because that was based off a text by Bruno Latour called Circulating Reference, where he talks, well, the text is about something else, but he talks about the gestures in the field versus the lab. Yeah.
Hola.
Hola.
Hi, how are you? So, if I can, I would like to bring you back, if you're able to the answer that you give to Dr. Amorin's second question. And since you brought up that paper on the Bernini's clay modeling techniques, and you were describing the way in which hands were used to discover this statue, right? But I was thinking, even looking through your clips, if this is even relevant to you, because what I get from your idea of gesture and how there's the idea of thought being vesseled through the hand, if you think about the idea of hand not only as a tool of analysis or of conveying thoughts, but as an organ of thought in itself. If this idea of not thinking about the hand just something that comes after thoughts, after the head which you refuse to, and I think, show on your film. I think it's quite cool, because you refuse the head as the thinking object, but you have a lot of scientific procedures that performed thoughts and made through the hand. And with this, I would like to maybe bring a small provocation to Dr. Daniel and Dr. Carlos, that I think that this idea of game could not enclose what's happening here. In Portuguese, we have this difficulty, but I think it's much more about play and eternal play anywhere or another than game in itself. Just if you could comment on this, if it makes any sense to you.
Yeah, no, completely. I think you answered your own question. I think you can articulate it a lot better than I can. But it's the idea that I think I spoke about a little bit of the procedural memory, which is like a physical, like when we learn, like the typical one is the learning to ride on a bike, right? It's like it's funny that they call it procedural memory as well, because it has to do with process, rather than it being like a physical memory. I'm curious about, I need to look that up more, of why it's called a procedural memory. It might have to do with repetition, more than being just a physical memory. But of course, memory always connects to the hippocampus, to the brain. So whatever it is you're doing, even if it is like something that you're not consciously thinking about, it's always going to connect neurologically, I guess, to the head. But yeah, it's, although like it is scientific, but then at the same time, it's not. Like I think maybe there is a lot that isn't. I think the knowledge that a lot of these conservators have is obviously scientific knowledge, but it goes beyond that. And it has to do with I guess to be a doctor, you can't have a shaky hand, and to be a conservator, you can't really have a shaky hand either, or you're going to ruin the object. So it has to do with more than like just the knowledge of something. It has to do with like you say, the physical interaction with it. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it's interesting to think about, and yeah. Mm.
So yeah, there was this kind of crisis in the field of mathematics, which would be like far away from any physical or haptic, because the main brand has produced chalk sticks that I still highly used in mathematics, closed up, and a lot of really hardcore mathematics do not use computers. They need to feel, and they talk about the idea of trace and gesture in mathematics as well, in rhythm. So the whole field of mathematics was like in chaos, because they were losing this specific tool that I needed to think. And they mentioned a lot that even the connection to hippocampus and memory and all of that, that both things are constructed in circularity. How do you think about our brain without thinking about our hand? It's like this idea of our hermeneutic circle in a way or another. So even this, it was curious to think about mathematics, this in theory so abstract fields, being in complete mayhem because they were losing this small tool where they can actually feel the rhythm and feel and flow through abstraction in a way or another.
I thought you were going to say something. I thought you were going to help me. No. I mean, that's really interesting. I love it. I don't really know what to say in response. It kind of, I don't know if I'm going to go off on a different one, but it kind of has to do, like when we think about science, we think about it like precision, but we don't necessarily think about how, like, the construction of facts, and like these facts are being able to be found because of funding in a way. Like, it's like everything is coming from somewhere. It's not like, oh, it's concrete because it was able to have the studies to find out that it was like it is something, or it is scientific or something. It's not just like scientific because of that. I don't know. It's kind of a different answer to your question, but maybe it's there somewhere. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk, Jessica. I have a question related to the film Those That at a Distance Resemble Another. So you have this proximity with hands, bare hands specifically, and in one of your clips here, you showed, I don't know if it's not the only one, that people are using gloves while working on that ivory Indian box. For me, as a conservator, was it something organic in your work to work with people who didn't use gloves, or did you ask them to take off the gloves as like uncovering the people who work closely with those objects that we usually cherish? Because it is an artistic thing, but for us, we conservators are not considered as artists, sorry, but we rarely touch the objects with our bare hands. So was it an organic process or not?
I never asked them to take their gloves off. Yeah. Also, in the film, that's funny, I've never had that's an interesting question, because I always get asked by conservators about the nails, because they're like, oh my God, how do they have their nails painted? And I had that question as well, but then the conservators said, well, if it's gel, it actually doesn't make a difference with the objects, but if it's like the normal nail varnish, it can come off on the objects. So they don't use that. They have like kind of the thicker gel polish that actually look after their nails if they're working with different chemicals, and they mostly were saying those kinds of things. But no, I never asked them to really do anything. The only thing I would ask them to do sometimes is repeat actions. Like if I see something and I wasn't able to film it and I really wanted to film it, I'd ask them maybe to repeat the same gesture. But no, if they didn't wear gloves, they weren't wearing gloves. And I didn't wear gloves because I had those amazing pink nails. I wasn't going to cover them with gloves. So that, like me on the tusk, I'm not a conservator. But yeah, it's a good question. I'm trying to think now. Erenjira didn't wear gloves, but she did wear gloves when she was wrapping it, but she didn't wear gloves when she was tracing because it was already wrapped in plastic, I guess. And she's an archaeologist, but she's definitely doing like conservation work, I think, in a way, by like, yeah, maybe. I'm trying to think of, my memory is obviously very bad, so I'm trying to think of other moments. It's actually an interesting question because it gets asked. I mean, we were talking about film archiving and conservation, that there is an argument I really don't know enough to be talking about this, but there is an argument when you're restoring film as to whether to wear gloves or not. Obviously, I remember Tony saying to me, no, actually, it wasn't Tony, it was in the other film, in the the film that I made with David of the sculpture at the Tate Modern, at the Tate Britain, I was very annoyed at Tate Britain because they wouldn't let David touch the sculpture without gloves on. And they didn't say that it was for conservation purposes. They said that they were scared of people seeing the film and thinking that they could just walk up to an object in the museum and touch it. That was their reason. And then when I spoke, I was always, and he had to wear gloves, and I got him transparent gloves, and I was like, but like the whole point of a blind person being able to touch a sculpture is that they actually feel it and they don't have gloves. But anyway, it ended up making a really good sound, so it was good for the film. Where was I going with this? Oh, and I think I must have mentioned this to Tony or one of the other conservators, and they said to me, yeah, some of these, with a lot of these objects are, what is it called? I'm asking, the fingerprints are like limas, nail files. Yeah, like nail files for some of the objects, and it's also the oils. I mean, you can tell me more than I know, but yeah, I never told them to take their gloves off, but yeah. Yeah.
All right, thank you for the questions and the comments, and I ask you to join me in thank you, Jessica, for the talk. Thanks.
Thanks, obrigada.